Jen, firstly, welcome to COB, and thank you very much for being here with us. It's very clear from watching this film that this is an agenda that's very important to His Majesty. What role do you think his leadership plays in galvanizing corporate engagement, especially given what we saw in the poll earlier?
Yeah, so His Majesty obviously has over 50 years of experience advancing sustainable causes across, nature, people, and planet. And I think with that, he brings enormous credibility. His Majesty is also king of 15 different countries, we call them realms, and he's also the head of the Commonwealth. So in terms of diplomatic engagement, if we talk about world leaders, over many, many years, he's had a huge amount of respect in the global community. So bringing that credibility on sustainability and his global convening power at the highest levels of global government is, much of the reason why people are listening to him. And I think, what I have found engaging with all of these CEOs and even world leaders is that being a CEO can be a very lonely place. And you're trying to do something that's never been done before. This transition has never been attempted before, and that's why it's difficult. And we heard some of the great things Gregory was saying is, this is a team sport, and often CEOs are just either you're dealing with competitors, or you're at the top, you have to take the difficult decisions. And just knowing that somebody with the level of credibility is standing behind you as a CEO, and you can sort of look to him and he can encourage you and say, great job, or you could do a bit more. I think CEOs really appreciate that level of support that His Majesty provides our community.
Yes, thank you very much. And it's very palpable, isn't it, when you see the film? So if you were to summarize, where do you think we've got to on how to articulate the business case, the economic case for engaging in this sustainable transition? How well is it understood, I guess, is the question.
I guess for all of us who are in it, it seems so obvious. I'd say for the king, he's like, I've been talking about this for 50 years, why are people so late to the party? But we always have seen it when we're talked about, risk. Gregory's talked about risk and opportunities. We've always seen it as the growth story of our time because, eventually, we know oil and gas, eventually will run out. So if you're investing in that, if you're looking from a long-term perspective, you're investing in stranded assets, and anything that industry supports, you're investing in stranded assets in shipping and aviation and every other sector. So if we want to innovate for growth, and if we're thinking about future generations of our children and our grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, why aren't we investing today in that brighter future and one that offers huge opportunity? And I think by coming together and creating those demand signals and saying we're all ready to go, every part of the puzzle is here, then we can actually move a lot faster.
Sure. Now, I've got lots of questions for you, but I'm going to ask the people in our room also to send some questions. But before we get into that, Jen, I'm fascinated by how you got into this, and how did you end up doing this pretty unique job? And did you always think you were going to end up working at the global stage, bringing corporates together with a monarch of 15 realms to tackle the climate emergency? How did this happen for you?
It's one of those things you really don't predict. But I started, I think a lot of people have lots of passion for things they care about, and I do just encourage, you've had some young people involved in the COB this year. I think it's really important that we encourage our young people to follow their passions and lean into those as much as possible. Because I think that's where you eventually find your space, doors open, and as long as you're using that as your guide, you get to amazing places. And so I started in humanitarian affairs, international development. I then moved into foreign affairs, and then I really recognized that whether it's conflict, poverty, giving people opportunity, at the bottom, the base of everything is, or the center of everything is economic growth. We need to be able to teach people to fish and take care of themselves and their communities. And so I did my MBA to sort of bring, all these different worlds that don't often talk to each other, the public sector, the private sector, the philanthropic sector, they don't necessarily talk to themselves as equal partners in the same exact conversation. And I really felt, that the private sector has to be at the center of that. But as a diplomat, I was seconded in to work for His Majesty. He had private secretaries. He had one private secretary as Prince of Wales to represent the Commonwealth. the rest of our colleagues were all from the UK, and so that rotated between Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and I was the Canadian candidate, and I was very fortunate to keep, getting extended a little bit. COVID happened, and then obviously His Majesty became king, and I was with him in that journey. But what he was really looking for is some way to take his lifetime of work and bring it to the world stage in a way that would be super, super powerful. And so this public-private philanthropic convening at the top tables of the world and getting the leaders' attention and decision makers to sort of really commit to act very, very quickly in line with the 2030 targets and the wider, longer-term transition was really, really important to him. And so the Sustainable Markets Initiative allows him a platform even now where we can support his global engagement, whether it's bilaterally or multilaterally. So that's sort of been my journey to get here. But I think we're all, whatever sector you represent, we need you in this solution. So.
Thank you very much, Jen. And my understanding as somebody who's sort of listened to this and seen the film a couple of times is that His Majesty is really invoking something very big in British history anyway, with this idea of firstly a terra carta, a new commitment, a new contract, a new compact with the world, and then an astra carta, a new compact with space. And the SMI, as I understand it, is the platform for bringing business leadership into that co-commitment with him and with others, as far as I can see it. And this has an echo, of course, in the Magna Carta of 800 years or so ago. Is the idea then to bring business into a permanent relationship with these ventures, this transition, this pathway? Is that the idea? This is not just a club, is it? It's you have to make a commitment to be part of it.
Yes. Yeah, and I think it was really important as we drafted this. So obviously, the Magna Carta gave rights to people, and the Terra Carta is giving rights to nature and to our planet, and we have this sort of responsibility. And then the Astra Carta is really giving rights to the wider universe, that we're about to discover as the next frontier for humanity. I think that one of the key things is it is a long-term commitment. It's a multi-generational commitment. If we listen to the world's indigenous peoples, that's something that they talk about a lot, is thinking 7 generations ahead. And the Magna Carta has this lasting power that we see in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's sort of really become foundational with the US Constitution and things. And so we hope that this is a permanent example of how the private sector needs to be brought in. And when we developed it, we made sure that the private sector is aligned with what governments have agreed. So the SDGs, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Convention on Biological Diversity, so that we're not in a different zone doing our own thing. It's we're trying to align with what the world is asking us to do. And some of the discussion earlier was about the NDCs, or the nationally determined contributions of countries. And the private sector needs to sort of work hand in hand with countries to help them implement. But I think there's still a big gap in terms of implementation that I think we still need to talk about. Yeah.
Now, I want to come on to ask you about the inspiring companies and what they're doing and everything else. But there's one question that's already popped up here, which says that, in the past, His Majesty was occasionally criticized by politicians or by certain businesses for being too forceful and too vocal on the environment and sustainability and planetary rights and everything else. Has that changed, or does he still face criticism in some quarters?
I imagine he faces criticism in some quarters, but when he became king, he has new constitutional responsibilities, not just in the UK, but with these 15 realms. And I think that, he's needing to shift a little bit about where he used to be very vocal. He would maybe be up on the stage here. I'm sure it would be more interesting for many people, but he doesn't have the same ability to come out and talk about policy in the way that he used to. But I think that what he's seen over his lifetime, that he has faced a lot of criticism, and I think early adopters, visionaries do face criticism, and I think, again, CEOs who are trying to do things different in their company are going to face criticism. And I think he's an example of like the importance of persistence, and if you really believe in something, just keep going. And I have to say, it's not easy. And I haven't faced the level that he's faced, but it is a difficult thing. And I think, again, he just demonstrates to us the importance of just moving forward and just doubling down on your beliefs and keep going.
Right, thank you very much. And by the way, we're very happy to have you here, Jen.
He's a bigger draw.
Let's start talking about the companies for a minute, because there are a lot of other questions coming in about how many charters do we need, and is it confusing? And there's one big question at the end, which is, what do you want companies in this room to do, which we'll get to later. But let's talk about the companies that His Majesty and indeed yourself find inspiring. What are the companies that are in the lead here doing, and how do you see their commitment? What is visible to you and to him in terms of their leadership here?
So again, there's so many different companies, and the SMI is structured by industry and financial group. And so we have, from aviation, energy, shipping, health, fashion, banking, private equity, insurance, and we have all of these players. And for the first 5 years, it was very much about, rallying the troops. We were building coalitions of the willing, sector by sector. And, increasingly what we're seeing is that, there are interdependencies between industries that, require higher levels of collaboration. And we can't really move forward on things like sustainable aviation fuel or, green ammonia or, really thinking about our health systems if we're not all actively part of, everybody's story. Some of the inspirational, there's so many different companies. We have very large multinationals, we've got EY as a member, so thank you so much for that. But Bank of America is our chair. To some of the innovators, we in the video you see the Terracotta Design Lab, which is really working with design schools in a multidisciplinary fashion to bring forward innovative new solutions. In aviation, which is sort of an example that most people can relate to, a huge push over the past 5 years has been sustainable aviation fuel, and we've seen a huge growth in that. And again, it's not one single player, it's a multitude of players helping to drive that success forward. Obviously, there's a lot more to do, but when we talk about transitioning aviation, we also need to be thinking about not just being narrowly focused on one solution. We have to recognize that airports are part of that. Ground transport, innovations in aircraft design, thinking of things like supersonic flight, really thinking further down the road. And we need the innovators to be part of that conversation. So I think the SMI brings together a whole range of different inspirational companies, from the financing that enables transition to the big players who are in charge of so many large supply chains around the world, to the actual sort of innovators and members of that supply chain. So it's hard to pinpoint any one. They're all doing amazing, great things, and one of the SMI's jobs is to amplify those success stories.
Yes, and clearly that's happening, and they're very much here. Let's ask the question about small businesses, Jen, because a number of the companies in the room are small businesses. There are big businesses here as well, and obviously small and big businesses work together. You're quite deliberately and consciously, I think, convening the big businesses, but how can small businesses get involved, and what does SMI mean for small businesses?
Mm-hmm. And I think, so there's a few different theories of change on this. So recognizing global multinationals have huge amounts of capital to mobilize. I think that's part of the reason. Also huge supply chains that we need. So if the big company shifts, how do they then shift from whether you're an investor or a financer or throughout your whole supply chain? Is that the expectation as a member of the SMI is that you're bringing your clients and your supply chain with you on this journey, and you're helping to lead by example. And so as a theory of change, that's sort of how we see a bit of a tipping point. But at the same time, there are businesses, SMEs all over the world looking to be part of the solution as well. And we increasingly need to bring them into the conversation. with the big players, but also just looking at, what are solutions for different sizes of companies across different sectors, and how do we have a common conversation and make this a team sport that it has to be. And so I think that that's something that the SMI now, after 5 years, we're looking at how do we do this effectively and efficiently. And I think working with the Glasgow Chambers of Commerce, for example, is a really helpful way. We are a relatively small team in the SMI, but we're trying to drive a global systems level agenda. And we have to work with key partners who can sort of help us enable this. Because, there are people in rooms like this all over the world having this exact same conversation. How do we link all of that up? How do we empower? How do we support to make this, journey profitable from an economic case standpoint, but also inspirational, so that the drive continues to be there and that the momentum builds so much that politicians and others who might want to disrupt the progress we're trying to make, will be able to continue.
Seems to me that you're saying two quite important but distinct things there. One is that big businesses, of course, provide services to small businesses. Small businesses are in their supply chains, they finance them, there's procurement mechanisms, there's all sorts of ways in which they're part of their scope 2 to scope 3 agenda. But you're also saying something about working with the conveners of smaller businesses as well. And there's a question here that's come up in the Q&A from the group. What would you like to see happening at the global level, the national level, and the local level? And then there's a specific question which we'll come to about the UK, and there's an even more detailed one about Glasgow. But how do you see the global, the national, and the local fitting together in all of this?
Yeah, I think there's some interesting lessons to be learned from multilateralism. I always say that there is no UN for the private sector, and a lot of governments just sort of assume that the private sector convenes as they do in New York, and we have this representatives sort of negotiating on our behalf, but that's not actually the case. So I think at a global level, the SMI is trying to be a platform like the United Nations in many ways, where you have the top CEOs of the world really coming together on a common agenda and helping to drive that forward. But over time, we've also recognized that sticking at the global level is not enough to actually ensure that there's implementation happening on the ground and that it's locally and regionally relevant. And so we have country and regional hubs around the world to sort of have those conversations where and it's really important that the global conversation isn't in isolation from the regional or the local. And so what we have to do is, at first we were doing, it's really important to understand lessons in this journey, but at first we would bring together, whether it's a Brazilian community of Brazilian CEOs that are trying to advance transition in Brazil and potentially access international markets. But what was actually really important is recognizing that many of our multinationals have a presence in Brazil as well. And the Brazilian companies are looking for opportunities to connect into the global marketplace. And so you can't have just a Brazilian conversation and we're having a global conversation. We have to bring those two communities together. And then inside Brazil, you're going to have Sao Paulo, you're going to have Rio. Like, how are you going to then make it really relevant to the businesses in those areas? And again, you have to have a pull through from global, regional to local. And it has to feed up from local, regional to global as well. So I sort of see it like that. It is a huge challenge in terms of like really mobilizing. But again, I think, we are now in an era of private sector leadership. We are seeing breakdowns around the world on political leadership and multilateralism. Things are no longer fit for purpose, and the private sector at all levels has the opportunities to step up and be a very strong voice for the way the world goes in the future.
Great, thank you very much, Jed. And let's go to the two specific cases that have come in from the room. So people would like to know, where would you like to see the UK being positioned on this? And I guess you might want to talk about the Commonwealth as well. But in particular, where would you like to see the UK? And it says, is there a specific ask of business leaders in the UK? And let's add the Commonwealth. And if there is, what would it be?
So I think at a time of geopolitics and headwinds that we're seeing, the private sector voice is extremely important, and the UK's voice is extremely important. I think being here in Glasgow, having been here for COP26 was really like the foundational moment where the private sector was invited by the UK government to be part of the discussion. And I think, now now it's our time to, continue to demand a seat at the table. But the UK, because of its history on this, and because it is, and we're addressing things like green hushing, we can't have countries green hushing right now. We need the UK to continue its course of ambition to help lead the world and provide a counterbalance to those who might say, this isn't as important as energy abundance in other areas, and that would derail everyone. Like the amount of hard work done by the private sector, they could have just sat this one out and let the government sort it out themselves. We would have never gotten as far as we've gotten. So again, there's a huge amount of progress that's happened over the past 5 years. But again, it does actually come down to UK leadership, and I think we are seeing the political leaders of the new government stepping up on this. And it's just important that they don't lose their courage, and they will be emboldened if the private sector is behind them, because at the end of the day, economics really drives a lot of the political conversations. So how do we ensure that everyone in this room and all across the country are coming together as one voice as much as possible, again, industry by industry, or a combination of industries, and say, like, how can we support the UK's agenda, and then demonstrate to the world what's possible with government and private sector collaboration.
And if I may, a sort of a cheeky side question here. Obviously, in your own home country,
yes.
Mark Carney, who is a great advocate on climate and has been a business leader on the climate agenda, is now the Prime Minister. Is it the same advice for Canada? Is that what you want to see Canada doing?
I would love to see Canada step on the world stage a little bit more, to be honest with you. But I think UK has been leading, to be honest. So where has Canada been on the world stage? And that's something that I do hope Mark takes advantage of. We have the G7 coming up. The SMI delivers market signals. So in terms of like that global conversation and us bringing the private sector voice, in Cornwall in 2021, just before COP, I guess, we had all the business leaders and the G7 leaders all having a conversation without staff. Like, it was the first ever conversation like that at a G7, and that's again the level of decision makers you need to bring to the same exact table so that we can accelerate the agenda. And I do hope Canada will take advantage of that leadership opportunity. And sometimes you do need to sort of stand up in the face of, whether it's the US administration or someone else. It's like, we can't just be led down a path that we don't agree with. And I think standing up to those things is really important. So I do hope that Canada will take that. And I think that Mark will. I think he's a solid guy.
Yeah. I think a lot of us in the room are pretty confident that he's, as you say, a solid guy. Yeah. There's a specific question about Glasgow and small businesses, and how would you like to see, a business community like the business community in Glasgow engage with SMI? What would work? What would look good for you?
Yeah, like I said, it's just really helpful to have a partner like Glasgow Chambers of Commerce to help us bridge the gap between what we're doing and what you guys are doing locally. The way we've been structured is again very much along industry lines. I think it's helpful to understand whether it's the space industry. I just learned yesterday that Glasgow is a great space
Sure.
for space, and so I'm really excited to bring the Astra Carta to Glasgow and explore that leadership role that Glasgow can play there. But if we sort of start by connecting the industry conversations, but then looking at, okay, if in Glasgow we want to accelerate any one industry on the transition journey, how can we then connect with the regional and the global opportunities that are there? And then again, what are the interdependencies? Like, how do we crowd in the right people to make Glasgow succeed in the way that it wants to? So if we can help, I think that we'd love to.
Great. Now, Jen, in about 7 minutes, I'm going to ask you my final question, which is about looking forward and what we should be looking out for. But there's 2 or 3 questions here that are kind of asking the more difficult questions. So one of them says, is there a risk that we have too many declarations, sustainable development goals, agreements, commitments, charters, and we end up losing focus? How does it come together, and how do we get a single focus here when there's so many different initiatives going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a question, and that's why, like, when we started, we aligned ourselves to what's already out there. Like, we're not trying to invent something new. But what we're trying to do is encourage like the private sector to understand like how you can support those various agendas. But for example, we have a climate COP and we have a nature COP and we have a desertification COP. CEOs are very busy. It's very hard for us to get CEOs to travel to all of these places and be at every table. We want them at the G7, we want them at the G20, and the king might be traveling to Italy, so we'd like you to go there too. CEOs aren't diplomats and don't have that kind of time to just travel everywhere to sort of address all of these diverse agendas. I think for the king, he sees all of this as one thing, like nature and climate are actually mutually, and oceans is another area, but the way they're handled by global governments is sort of very siloed. And I think, whatever the private sector can do to just recognize that transition is a journey. We also are a very big tent, so inside the SMI we have oil and gas companies, which many sustainability organizations might not have in, but it's about transition. So many of these oil and gas companies are actually integrated energy companies. They're investing in renewables, they're investing in things like hydrogen. So we need to be with them on their journey and meet people where they are. Some people are starting today, some people started 5 years ago, some people started 10 years ago. And it's really important that, in the SMI, we're just supporting everyone in their respective journeys. I think it's there's no right or wrong on how we exactly do this, but the key thing is sort of, trying to move in the direction of decarbonization, trying to move in the direction of nature positive. There's no prescription that I can give you on this is exactly how you should do it, because every business is going to be slightly different, every industry is slightly different. But the key thing is your organization should be prioritizing as much as possible a default sustainable orientation. So start from there and say where is there a discrepancy, and how do we then move ahead? And I think increasingly we're going to see sustainability, the efficiency gains, whether that's productivity, whether that's energy efficiencies, those are going to become very, very quickly competitive opportunities, right? So the businesses that are further ahead on AI or further ahead on sustainability will outcompete their counterparts. So the faster you get moving on this agenda, the more profitable you'll be and the more successful you'll be as a business, small businesses and large businesses.
It's really great that you've said that, Jen, because part of what we're thinking here at COB is that, last year we focused a lot on the opportunity of decarbonisation, and this year I think we're hedging towards the theme of the advantage of being, truly committed to a decarbonisation, a resilience, a biodiversity path, and what kind of advantage that gives to business. So that's fascinating. There's another question here that says, has SMI or His Majesty, or do you yourself have views on ascribing legal rights to planet, to rivers, to places, the sort of client Earth approach? Yeah. What's your perspective about that? And is that something that you and the CEOs have discussed?
Yeah, it is actually, because we have a legal task force. And we take a lot of inspiration from Indigenous and First Peoples around the world. Obviously in the Commonwealth, we have large Indigenous communities across the Commonwealth. And His Majesty for decades has been engaging with Indigenous communities, so he really values their wisdom. And this sense of nature being in somewhat sentient and deserving rights and protection, it's the lifeblood of our ability to live on this planet. Dirty water, pouring chemicals into water and poisoning our children is not what anyone wants. How do we protect them? How do we, whether it's from a corporate side, from a government side, obviously I don't think that we're doing enough. But it's really inspirational to see our legal task force with these legal companies and CEOs saying, we want to help this, whether it's through mediation, whether it's through innovative legal approaches. We've seen some great progress in places like New Zealand. I think we do need to be looking at this, and it's not just governments who should be thinking about it. And again, if you start from a default sustainable orientation and you realize that maybe your operations are harming our waterways or harming our oceans, get on that, right? That's even if there's no legal framework, it doesn't mean that action shouldn't happen. And I think it's much more about the opportunity rather than the punishment. And again, that's looking at it from a risk lens or for an opportunity lens. And I do hope that we can galvanize more legal support to do this, because I think there's some really good examples. And I might just give one example that we went with the King to Samoa for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. and trying to bring CEOs to travel all the way to Samoa. It's like a 3-day trip to get there. And you know, a lot of our CEOs were asking, well, what does Samoa want on transition? And you know, what they said, you know, it was an amazing opportunity to engage with local people and support them with things like mangroves, which many of you will have heard about. But they said, we don't want anything from you. We just want you to recognize that we exist. And if you don't take action in your own communities, we will no longer exist. Like, our history on this planet will be erased. And just our hope is that you see us. And there are people around the world who are in that exact position. And it's not just happening to emerging and developing markets, it's happening in developed economies as well. We're seeing these nature-related disasters. And so I just, I think it's a real opportunity for us to sort of do more.
Great, thank you. Now, Jen, I'm somebody who's very motivated by history, so the story of Magna Carta, Terra Carta, Astra Carta really makes sense to me. But Jim is asking the question, is there a risk that some of this language would put certain people off? And he's asking the question, what about young people? Is there a way that SMI tries to engage with young people, make this relevant and interpretable to them? What's the young person's engagement with SMI?
So we've had a few engagements. You know, some of the things that, you know, we do, whether it's our staff or our companies, we encourage them to engage with young people. Some of our staff have talked to schools. I've done a few talks to schools. I think it's really, I started my career as a psychologist, and I think it's super, with child development actually, but super fascinating to see, let's say 5-year-olds, they're uninhibited by what society says is possible. And they might not know all the technologies that are possible, but they can definitely visualize a future in a very imaginative way. And I absolutely think we need to be engaging our young people more effectively and bringing them in on the solutions, because increasingly, obviously, they are, you know, much more tech savvy than some of us, myself included. And we have to harness that because, you know, whether it's AI, or wider digital tools, like this is going to shape the future of transition. And I think we need to absolutely bring these voices in. How we do that effectively for the whole world, which is the SMI's mandate, I think, again, we have to rely on our partners, like, so all of our member companies, like asking them, what are you doing with young people? There's an interesting split I find with companies where, it's particularly large companies that might have their own foundations, you know, how aligned are that with corporate strategy? I think there's an opportunity there. Is like, you know, how are you using your philanthropic capital to help mobilize this agenda, including outreach to communities and young people and children? But, you know, definitely, I would encourage everybody to, you know, to talk about this. And I actually find that the Magna Carta, Terra Carta, Astra Carta is a compelling narrative from a historical standpoint, because it talks about like 800 years ago, and let's think 800 years in the future. Most people are thinking incrementally. You know, what's the next 5 years going to bring in terms of a political cycle, or what's the next, you know, quarter going to bring in terms of financial returns? But are we actually thinking 800 years ahead on what the future of this planet is going to look like, and what's our role today? And, you know, earlier I love the point about it's important to engage young people, but that doesn't absolve us from the responsibility we as leaders need to take today. And I'm going to be a CEO for a short period of time, so what am I doing to make sure that my time in my leadership seat is worthwhile? So I always challenge our CEOs with that.
Last question from me, Jen. When you look forward over the next 12, 24, 36 months, what are the things that you're looking for, the moments, the decisions that will tell you how things are going? How do you read the next period of time? What for you will be the meaningful moments that will either tell you some of the right things are happening or more of the wrong things are happening? Tell us what's in your mind about that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess all I know instinctively is that we need to mobilize more people, we need to accelerate, and we need to prove the economic case. So as I said before, the private sector hasn't been as organized as it needs to be to tell a compelling story. But we are seeing very strong data points. So $2 trillion in clean energy in 2024, that's huge. while our trajectory on, trying to maintain 1.5 degrees hasn't been as successful as we like, at least it's not 4 or 5 degrees where we were in 2019, right? So there has been good progress, but you need to, particularly in business, you need to be proving with stats, right? So, one of the key things that we do in the SMI is monitor trends across industries and across markets. That's really important to demonstrate the proof points and make the case. But the more people who are standing behind this and more people who are showing their examples of progress, the faster everyone else can learn from them, and the faster we can all leapfrog. So in the next 5 years, I would just love to see a growing movement, and that we are more effectively engaging with partners like the Glasgow Chambers of Commerce and other chambers of commerce and other networks out there in the world, and just being very intentional in how we crowd people in on solutions, make sure that we're going from one challenge to the next and we're accomplishing things. Because I think when you look at COPs and other government forum, it's often about announcements. It's often about, okay, we'll solve this with a fund. And there's no real accountability on did we actually do that? And at least I find in the private sector, we try to be accountable. We try to measure what we're doing. And I think if we can enhance that narrative in global forums, we're going to be more successful with the business case for everyone.
Jen, thank you very much.